I'm Barry Silverberg, Director of the Center for Nonprofit Studies at Austin Community College, and welcome to Civil Society, where we explore issues affecting our communal well-being through a nonprofit lens. We're a proud partner of ACC TV, but given COVID-19, we continue to operate virtually in this, our 5th season. This episode is part of our series on the Asian Pacific Islander experience in Austin, which includes people from at least 25 countries who represent 40 different ethnic groups. This diverse community makes up about at least 8% of Austin's population and is growing rapidly. According to a September 18, 2020 Austin American Statesman article, the Asian American population will actually exceed the Black population in the next few years. Asian Americans are often overlooked. Partly this can be attributed to the model minority myth, the assumption that Asians are wealthy, highly educated, and therefore not needing any social services. Today, we're going to focus on seniors and especially the needs of older Asian Americans. My guest is Shubhada Saxena, a community advocate for seniors and Asian Americans in Austin. She's the CEO of Aspire to Age, which is a public benefit corporation that focuses on ensuring cultural competency as we age. At the same time, she's a deputy ambassador for Aging 2.0, a global network of innovators who use technology and design to improve the lives of older adults around the world. Shubhada is a very busy person, as we're about to hear. She describes herself on LinkedIn as a visionary leader, an electrical and electronics engineer, a social worker, a passionate advocate for social justice, senior services and cultural competence, a business process consultant, a fundraiser, a board member, diversity mentor, City of Austin commissioner, Leadership Austin class of 2015 connector, a caregiver, caregiving trainer, and probably most important of all, a mother of, quote, 2 wonderful 20-something daughters. Her professional career includes founder and community steward of the Asian Impact Fund, the president and founder of the South Asian International Volunteer Association, the president and chief technology officer of Webify Global, and a number of other activities. Her volunteer career efforts reflect her passion and commitment to others. She's an advisory board member at KUT Public Radio, a former vice chair of the City of Austin Asian American Quality of Life Advisory Commission, which she served for 6 years. She's the founder and a community member of the Austin Pune, I hope I got that right, Sister City Initiative, an advisor, a member of the advisory board of the Indian American Coalition of Texas, a member of the Aging Services Council of Central Texas, a former board member of Family Elder Care, and a committee member of Citizens for Diversity and Leadership Roles, PAC, which is focused on Round Rock. I think the list of volunteer activities certainly shows Shubhada's focus and interests. And the list goes on. She is a graduate of the Birla Institute of Technology and Science in India, has a master's degree in social work from UT Austin, and has licenses and certifications in aging and health, nonprofit studies, and growing old around the world. After reading all that, I kind of wonder, what have I done with my life? But anyway, that's great. So I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to talk with you, Shubhada, and for us all to benefit from your insights and perspectives about the Austin Asian American community. And so let's welcome. So let's start with, tell us a little bit about yourself. Talk about growing up in India and coming to the United States.
Well, thank you so much, Barry, for inviting me here and giving this opportunity to talk. You know, growing up, I was a quiet person. I kept myself to myself, but I have changed myself to be able to speak publicly. But growing up in India was a wonderful experience. 2 sides of the family. My father is an engineer and always encouraged me, taught me STEM like subjects right from when I was born. Never distinguished between being a girl or a boy or, you know, that side. So really appreciated being educated and having the privilege and not being discriminated from that side. My mom's side of the family, she's a homemaker. She grew up in a more traditional urban setting. And she grows up with those gender specific roles and other things that we grew up with in a patriarchal society. So I've seen both sides of the equation. My father had a transferable job, so I had the opportunity of living in multiple urban areas and visiting rural areas with my mom's family. So I've felt myself to be, having diverse experiences growing up, and then the opportunity to come to the United States was also really amazing. But there was a theme that we learned growing up called unity and diversity, and I think India has a lot of diverse populations. We speak multiple languages, and it is a natural and normal
Mhm.
process. It is unlike the United States, where being bilingual is a oddity.
Yeah. So why did you come to the United States?
Well, as I graduated as an engineer in India, opportunities for electrical electronics engineers were fewer there. They were there, definitely. I remember there was one oil company that came and said they could not, while they interviewed me, they could not give me a job because I was a woman and they didn't have ladies' bathrooms in their oil rigs. So I just asked them to go ahead and build them, you know. So, but IT was an upcoming area in the information technology, and I had actually taken specific decisions to stay within India and not come here for higher studies at the time when I graduated. But 2 years down the road in my IT career, the world of opportunity had opened up. I was asked to go to Australia. I said no. UK, I said no. But when they told me that Motorola was a company that needed my skills, that was like one of the best companies in the world for an electronics engineer at the time with
Uh-huh.
technology growing. So for me, that was my main attraction that brought me here to the United States. Plus, I had the support of my entire family where they felt that I needed to have the opportunity to go global and travel the world and, be a global person. So that's what brought me to America is my work. And
So when you got to America, having grown up with a father at least who, didn't see gender roles per se, did you face any challenges or prejudices either as an Indian or as a woman in an area which I assume engineering is largely male dominated?
yes, it is. In a class of 450 students, we were about 22 girls. So it is, at the time, it was definitely male dominated. And IT, it's a very interesting field. While it is male dominated, they're more accepting of, they were more accepting for sure of all genders at the time. That was my personal experience, right? They weren't discriminatory, at least in this new field, which was developing, and anybody who had the skill was welcome to join. So for me, that was an advantage that I had. And I think there was an internal confidence that I had from having grown up and some spiritual experiences and stuff that I think tided me over anything where I felt there was probably a discrimination. Coming to America as an immigrant, I was welcomed because of the skill that I had in the professional spaces, for sure. In the personal areas, I remember them, giving us advice about personal hygiene and how we need to do certain things certain ways and cannot cook certain foods that smell differently. Or if we were to be stopped by a police person, what is the process that we have to follow? Put your hands on the wheel, don't get down, do not put your hands in your pockets. I mean, those were the immigrant experiences that we had. I don't think that was any different for a woman versus a man, but that's just what it was.
And so what led you to coming as an engineer, as an electrical engineer, I guess electronics? What led you to get involved with and concerned about seniors and Asian Americans and to grow into the advocate that you are today?
Well, I was very happy with my IT career, and we moved to the several, from Florida to Midwest and Michigan, Minnesota, and then here when I had my children. And it's very part of our normal, culture, I guess, in India to live in intergenerational households. So my mother-in-law was coming here visiting with us after she retired as a medical doctor and helping me take care of my girls. She used to come back and forth with her, visa, and we found out at some point that she had dementia. I did not even know what that word meant. I was in my, 20 years into my IT career working at IBM when I found out that there was a whole list of services that were needed when you had to take care of older adults. And while they were there for mainstream older adults sometimes or low income people, while my mother-in-law fit the low-income category, even though she was a professional herself in America, those services were not available. And so I, instead of being a systems thinker in an IT field doing program management, I switched over to managing a program where I could gather volunteers like her to be active parts of society here, which they
Mhm.
need now that they're living here. So that's what brought me to this field of aging and understanding what the different perspectives of Asian immigrants are and how do you solve those needs for this new immigrant community.
Interesting. So you obviously have a life philosophy. You seem to be very introspective, um, and you have some principles that guide you. Can you share what those are?
Sure. You know, I think growing up, I just learned to be a good human. You know, that is something that guided me. But after my mother-in-law got dementia and we went through a lot of things in our own family, I kind of went into a self-introspection mode and found that for me, a life of service gave me the most joy. Whether as a woman who was serving her family, as a professional who was serving her, the corporation that she was working for, or the clients as a consultant, that's what gave me the most joy. And so for me, the spiritual guidance or whatever led me to find, and I named the organization that I started Seva, SAIVA, it's said as Seva, but it means service. So for me, that has been a
Oh, interesting.
guiding philosophy where I would like to lead my life, because having received so much, money wise, privilege wise, or otherwise, and having been on the other side where I've seen prejudice and I've been at the other end of not having that privilege, I felt that I have a unique qualification to be able to understand both sides and be able to serve.
So you clearly, looking at your credentials, your volunteer activities, and looking at the education, the ongoing education that you've engaged in, you spent a lot of time educating yourself about the issues you're dealing with, which isn't always the case with volunteers. Okay, many people work out of their heart and not necessarily using their minds. Why do you find why is that so important to you?
Possibly the analytical skills that I got as an engineer, because I always, when I went to a first client, client first, they gave me a lot of information that I had to digest. So I feel that before you can be of help to somebody else, you need to be able to understand the situation, analyze it, look at it critically, and then do your additive piece. And that's something that I learned in Leadership Austin is additive leadership, which I believe, especially in a human service or perspective, you need to be able to understand who you're dealing with. So while I develop my public speaking skills, I'm actually going back to my original, listening mode a lot more now to understand and learn and use information in a way that's, that can help.
So let's thank you. Let's shift gears and let's talk generally about the Asian American community. So can you talk a little bit about the diversity of the community? I think many people, you know, Asian, you think of just what's common. And as I said in the beginning, it's an extremely diverse community, which I assume with very diverse interests and needs and generational and gender and nationality, etc. Talk a little bit about your experience with that diversity and a little bit about the diversity.
Absolutely. I mean, the last I looked at it, there were more than 50 countries that are part of Asia. And India itself has more than 20 national languages and then several dialects as a part of it, because India is like a Europe. And so every state is like a country of its own with its own language, with its own cultural, richness and, whether it's theater, music, or whatever it is that they're doing, and their thought processes, their poetry. So it is dealing with a lot of people who have pride in their cultural heritage. And coming to America, a lot of the times in the early, like either late 1800s, early 1900s, for Asian Americans meant assimilating within the American culture.
Right.
I think by the time immigration opened up in 1965 and a lot more of us started coming in the 80s, 90s, and beyond, retaining our cultural heritage is important just as much. So that diversity of our heritage has taken on a much more important meaning for us and passing that on to the next generation, because there are wonderful things that America brings and has, but there are also very important and wonderful things that our cultural heritage brings to America. So being able to put those two together in a way that we can move our society forward with the right principles, I think has become extremely important. So that diversity that we are talking about that Asia brings, like I said, more than 50 countries and so many different languages, we want to be able to harness that. America is still struggling with bilingual English, Spanish, right? So there's a whole world of opportunity where we can bring all the cultural influences we have to bear. And every statistic that I've looked at says that the diversity in your team brings richness and more value that you can create. So I'm just amazed. There was a professor from Rice University when we had our first Asian Health Summit in Houston several years ago, said that even in Houston, they're expecting that Asians are going to be 25% of the population as African Americans or Hispanic or white Americans in 50 years, which was about 2063 at the time when they were looking out. And I was amazed at that. I was like, okay, if you're going to be a quarter of the population and they're expecting that to be all of the United States, all of this rich heritage culture that we bring, needs to be absorbed.
Absolutely. So how is from your perspective, the Asian community or any subset that you want to pick up on being affected by the pandemic? There's obviously an increase in prejudice, increase in overt acts of hatred. Um, how is it affecting the population in general and specifically, because of your own interests, the elderly population?
I mean, there are several aspects to it. I think the pandemic has just highlighted some of these things even more. The prejudice has existed right from the, Chinese, rail workers being,
Right.
in trouble, or the Japanese internment. So there's been that anti-Asian sentiment. I think with the elections in 2016, the process just made it even more, where it came up where people whose lifestyle they thought was being impacted by Asian immigrants or other immigrants, that came to the forefront and became more visible and covert rather than, overt rather than covert. But the pandemic has just highlighted this even more, because when a virus originated from Asia has come here, and calling it the Chinese virus or something else, definitely people are now bringing those overt behaviors to bear with the pandemic. And we have seen things like where a Asian person gets thrown on the street and gets killed. I mean, it is coming to a point where it is a human rights issue. It's not just about being culturally different or being accepted. America is welcoming. Austin is a welcoming city. We're finding that while under the covers of the welcoming aspects, there are many people who are not as welcoming. We're trying to document that and trying to be there for the community, so have a voice with them. And the pandemic and your question about older adults and how they're getting impacted.
Yep.
Obviously, they're a much more vulnerable population. Luckily, a lot of them are living in multi-generational households, which have given them strengths and have supported the younger generations in the families, have become a source of support from the people that I'm talking to. But a lot of times their needs are ignored and they're prioritized last, where childcare comes first. And especially for an immigrant community, they're trying to establish themselves professionally, their children integrated into society, and older adults are the last in priority in terms of where their attention is given. So many a times their social isolation needs are not addressed or even recognized, because they live with their families, so people feel they're not isolated. But within their families, they are alone sometimes, and there is no outlet for them to express themselves or the ability to contribute to the society they live in. So there's a lot of different aspects, positive and negative, that the pandemic has brought out for within the society.
So what I'm hearing you say is many of the issues have been there. The pandemic has just highlighted them. Yep.
Yes.
So is there a problem of isolated elderly in the Asian community? I mean, people that are not living as part of households.
Definitely. I mean, there are communities like the refugee communities, whether they come from Burma, Syria. I mean, Asia is a huge continent.
Right.
So there are the asylees that come in. There are different population groups, the Vietnamese community who are limited English speakers. Their ability to participate in the society. As a social work intern, I was given several elderly Asian American people as my clients as a case manager. And being South Asian, I was being offered clients who were Vietnamese American or Korean American, whose nonverbals I did not recognize. They're just as different to me as
Right.
any other American would. So definitely there are people who've been marginalized, whose needs need to be recognized and brought forward. Because when you look at the monolithic numbers, Asian communities look like they have the best education or the highest income, but there are so many pockets of Asians that are not being served right now because those systems of care are not in place. Pipelines for services are not there, and they don't know how to access them with limited language.
Yeah. I think most people don't realize that. I mean, I think that, the people aren't aware of the size of the population, the needs of the population, the diversity of the population. So you started Aspire to Age, and you're involved in, I'm not sure what your role was, but Aging 2.0, both of which are concerned with, I never heard this term before, but the longevity economy. Okay. Being on the older side, I like the idea of longevity, but that's another issue entirely. Um, Talk a little bit about the longevity economy and what the work of Aspire to Age is about in terms of cultural competency and also Aging 2.0.
Absolutely. Being from a tech background, for me, cutting edge technology has been always very exciting. And when I came over to the human services field, that was something that I felt like I missed and have the ability and the skill to be able to bring it to bear. In the social services space, people generally don't have as much money in as in the IT space or in the new innovation space. So for me, being able to use those innovation techniques that we learned in systems thinking and bringing them here was extremely important. And being able to do it was good. So Aging 2.0 looks at all of the innovation that's happening around the world. They have over maybe, I don't know, 200 chapters now in different cities. And so we, as Austin being the innovative town that we are, and the creative space that we have, we have a chapter here that we have been trying to harness what's happening in this space. Because example, South by Southwest a couple of years ago when we had it in person, I went to the convention center. I was talking to different companies that were there, who were sharing their innovation, and asked them, what are you doing in the longevity economy? So they first didn't understand what that meant. When you think of older adults, traditionally they say, oh, we have like a health and human services department, or we have some nonprofits, that deal with older adult issues. So it was looked at as a silver tsunami, which is a force of destruction, rather than the strengths perspective, which we like to use in the nonprofit world and social work, where we look at what the capabilities are. What we have is older adults who have a lot of money that they've amassed over their lifetimes. We have people who have grown up in a globalized world and ruled the world for a long time. So they are used to making their own decisions and changing the world the way they need to. So there is a huge group of older adults, baby boomers, immigrants, otherwise, who have the capacity to pay for and make changes the way they want to. And so Joseph Coughlin, I think, who from MIT, who's coined that word of the longevity economy and has a book about that, I felt was a very appropriate book to share with these innovators that had come to South by and tell them that there is money here. There is people who have the ability and should be making their own choices as they grow old, rather than being thrown in a nursing home and saying that's the only option you have. So the longevity economy brings to bear all of the innovation that is happening in an economy where people have the resources to pay for it and the ability to make choices with the changes that they would like. That's where Aging 2.0 plays. Aspire to Age, for me, has been a very interesting, after having experienced the nonprofit side of the world, where I feel that sometimes change is slower because of the fact that the funding and the policy, the board leaders come from industry. their primary responsibilities are first towards their own family, then towards their corporations or businesses that they're working in, and then to the nonprofits. So it took a whole year or more for funding to come to the nonprofits that they are now distributing, for example, with the pandemic. So I felt that a public benefit corporation has the ability to pivot and make the necessary innovation happen. So a couple of things that Aspire to Age has started to focus on, while we have a bigger vision about it. As you said, it's aspiring to age in a society where we don't feel that aging is a bad thing, but we can aspire, which everybody wants to live old and not die early. But right now, the mainstream culture tells you that growing old is not a good thing. But what we've started with is caregiving, because I felt that there was a huge need or a gap in the caregiving, and how instead of person-centric care that our wellness systems talk about, hospital systems, it needs to be a culture-centric wellness process. Because while my mother-in-law had certain abilities and skills, her community had to come together to care for her. It couldn't be just one family or just the wellness systems we have. So in the caregiving aspects, we're trying to build out cultural appropriateness and care. So bringing the community together. So we have a caregiving service that we're mobilizing. The second thing, in the technology side of me, we've now filed a provisional patent for a platform which we call Keep Fluent, which will allow us to provide services in a more open format and bring them to bear with trusted providers. And those trusted providers can be culturally appropriate and provide different services, whether it's food, or language services, or the music that you listen to. So those kind of things. So the tech platform called Keep Fluent is something that we're working on a lot.
So when you use the word culturally appropriate, could you kind of expand on that?
Absolutely. I mean, a simple example is when my mother-in-law needed meals delivered. She was an older adult, and Meals on Wheels does deliver meals. But the food that they deliver right now is not what she ate. And in her dementia, I felt that it was important to give her food that she enjoyed and was her comfort food where she grew up. So she could enjoy it. Her memories were from that time, and she remembered those things. And healing is dependent on your comfort. And so for me, that is a very good example of how can we make sure that people who are receiving food are receiving the culturally appropriate food so they can heal properly. Whether it is the music, like I remember a wonderful volunteer from Hospice Austin who used to come and they would belt out songs together for a whole hour. The songs that she grew up with was important, right? Because then she would enjoy that music. We at Family Elder Care, we have some amazing services like Lifetime Connections Without Walls, but the services that they provide, the music that is given, or the language in which the pandemic situation is explained, the vaccine is explained to them so that they understand and are not hesitant to take the vaccine. Explaining it within the cultural context is extremely important, because otherwise people are not willing or able to receive the services. And it's just not right for our community to ignore people or not give them boil water notices because they speak a different language, right? Because it's a health concern. They need to able to understand and learn. So providing the services, for example, that the city is giving in terms of information about what's Austin Public Health doing, and keeping it in the cultural context so that people understand and are able to take action. That is important.
So it's really about respecting the individual and seeing them as a person rather than seeing them as an object in many ways.
Right, and giving the right respect to the community who can bring the services together when needed, so that the community can come together. It's not just about individualistic services also, because there are a lot of sources of support. We talk a lot about independence in America. There's a lot of talk about interdependence now, because we are all interdependent on each other. And I think that the cultural context in that interdependence is important as well.
Absolutely. So you served at least 6 years with the Asian American Quality of Life Commission. And during your time, I think there were several studies that were done. I think those were during, in many ways, the formative years when a lot of the research was being done, without citing numbers and all that sort of stuff. Can you share some of the lessons learned that you had from that experience of being vice chair of the commission?
Sure. The first thing that I learned was about identity, because what is Asian American, right? It's a construct that we've created. And who do you include in there? Who do you not? Who do you study? Because what we did, because we needed to get something done quickly, we took the five more majority Asian groups, which is Indian, Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, and Filipino. And we found out that Chinese, we wanted to be more inclusive. So we included all the people who spoke Chinese, which ended up to be people from Macau or Taiwan, and found out really fast that Taiwanese don't want to be called Chinese. So there's a lot of lessons we learned about identity in the process. And what does quality of life mean for a person? It's having choices and ability. That's how I understood it. But from the study, even though we took the five majority groups, we tried to do a lot of qualitative analysis of all the different 50 countries, whoever wanted to step up to give us input. A few things that came out. One was, of course, the language, limited English capability of the Vietnamese, Korean, and a few other communities, which had to be addressed right away. So we've been working for more than 6 years with language access work, and the pandemic actually highlighted that need a huge amount, where the messages weren't going out in language. We need to make sure. So language was one of the biggest things. The second thing that came out for me is mental health issues. Access to mental health care by the Asian American communities is different. They don't go to the traditional counseling or other mechanisms we have set up, and they are not even available in culture. So exploring how our mental health, how is mental health care accessed, and how do we make sure that these things are available to people? Because if you look at mainstream America and see what Asian American nonprofits are there may be some for advocacy for human rights, immigration, but definitely every city almost has one domestic violence organization for Asians, which is very sad to say. And that domestic violence situation comes in because of the mental health issues that are out there. People don't deal with them, and they come out in behavioral ways that they shouldn't. So second thing is taking care of the mental health of the population, and thing was very important. And the third and big thing for me, out of the 15 recommendations under the 5 pillars that we discussed, 9 of them were on community engagement. So how do you engage this community, which is so diverse? How do you make sure that their voices are heard, and that we can incorporate that into all of the work that's being done by the city? So for me, those 3 things, stood out the most, which is language access, mental health care, and then community engagement among all of the recommendations.
Interesting. And by the way, we will put the link to those reports on the website, so people, because the commission has a number of very interesting and useful reports, and people can have access to that. So being interested in the relationship of the Asian community, the lack of understanding of it, et cetera, or appreciation of it, what do you feel some of the major misperceptions that whites or Anglos, or however you want to describe, people have of Asians, in addition to what we talked about?
First of all, I think there's no data available. So unless you're connecting with the community in some way, you wouldn't know about the diversity. When I talked to the Texas Tribune for the first time, and I looked at the data on our state's website, for example, right? There is no data. There's very little data on even the numbers of Asian Americans that are there, right? Whether if you look at health data, for example, right? I had an Asian American doctor talking about the health data of Austin, and they were sharing numbers which did not include Asian Americans. So uh, first of all, just having the data out there, I think, to let people know that there is this community in these numbers, and that there is so much diversity in there, is very, very important. Because I'll share an example of the Austin Pune Sister City Initiative work that we're doing.
Please.
There is a white person who joins us regularly, and the question was, so you speak English, and you speak okay English, but I'm having a hard time understanding you. Are there any Asian restaurants in Austin? Where are they? I mean, there's just so many Asian restaurants in Austin, right? the fact that a mainstream white Anglo person is not familiar with this tells me a story about how much there is a need for connecting cultural groups together. So, for me, the myths are there because people don't have an understanding, and uh, the information is not going across in the ways that people are accessing it. So that's the reason I think media is so important, and balanced media is important. And I serve on the board of KUT and KUTX, where not only news stories and sources of news stories are getting diverse, but also the music and other cultural representation in Austin. Because our children would feel bullied because they're different and they're not represented in mainstream culture. If you go to a museum, you might have a European exhibit, maybe an African exhibit, rarely a Latin American, but definitely not Asian. So this is something that is extremely important, being able to see yourself and other people being able to see you in the way that it is. And your question is extremely correct about what are the myths, because the myths have formed based on uh, watching National Geographic, which shows India as a country with elephants and snake charmers. If you only seen that, that is the only impression you have.
Yeah,
We want.
yeah. So let me take the question and kind of flip it on a reverse. For Asians coming to the United States with the intention of emigrating, and living here, what are some of the myths and misperceptions that they may have? I mean, when you came here, did you have any myths that kind of got blown apart once you started living here in the States?
Oh, it was interesting because I knew I was going to a different culture, right? And learning about it was important to me as an immigrant, right? And making sure that I continue to respect my own cultural heritage along with assimilating this was important to me. But I've heard various stories like, other people coming here, if they've only seen Baywatch, right? And they come to America, they're expecting everybody running on beaches, in whatever form. And they find that America values family a lot. And America takes care of its people in ways that maybe the world hasn't seen, because sometimes the stories that come to the rest of the world is America selling weapons, making war happen. So their view of America is of a dominating superpower that has spread some hate in the world sometimes. Coming to, for me at least, I had the, hopefully the humility to learn a lot more about the people. Getting to meet some wonderful and people around the country was very good for me as a personally as an immigrant. But there are other people who come here with certain misconceptions, and or maybe knowing that they'll be accepted but then be hurt by the pandemic related violence, for example, that have happened. So there's both sides of the equation where uh, America's, how it is viewed in the world is an important piece of us as Americans now, and we want to make sure that that view that the world has of America is of the kind and wonderful, caring, set of people that have sent out missionaries and other people in the world to do good things.
And for my own international travels, I mean, and just to confirm what you're saying is, I don't think many of us realize sufficiently how we're seen around the world. We see ourselves as good people. That's not necessarily the way we're seen in many places of the world because of actions and so forth. So you talked about the importance of maintaining your identity while assimilating, I think you used that word, in the United States. How do you do that in your family? How do you make sure that your children and their progeny, at some point, maintain that identification as Indian with all the positive values that come with that?
I think for me personally, within the family, it is lead by example. So if I made sure that my mother-in-law was taken care of, so my children see that this is a very important value that we bring, where we care for the people in the home, or how family matters so much, and how family traditions and what we practice matter so much. while we were building our family traditions, sometimes, there was conflict with my children who saw something outside being celebrated, which was not celebrated at home the same way that they did. We took traditions such as Thanksgiving and make them extremely important because gratefulness and Thanksgiving is part of our culture. So that's easy to integrate. Christmas traditions, maybe having the tree or Santa Claus coming in, that was tricky to navigate. We did do that, whether the tooth fairy coming in or Halloween, all of the traditions that are there here. How do you make that happen for your children? There's a really wonderful piece that NPR had done with Michelle Morris at some point, which the 6-word stories that she did, the race card project. I don't know if you're familiar with it, where one of the stories that I read was family eats rice, I eat pasta. So this lady was describing how her family grew up eating rice, but she wanted to be part of a very American culture and eat pasta. So her mother would wake up very early in the morning and make her the pasta and also make the rice for the family. So now this child, after having grown up, has realized the sacrifices that her mother put in so that she got what she needed while also honoring the tradition that they came from. So now she says, I really enjoy rice and I respect the rice, versus growing up, it was a conflict for me.
Right.
So I'm hoping that the traditions that we have established growing older, those are some things that our children can take forward, and also being represented in the mainstream, that they can learn to accept that and be able to pass that on to their children. So it is tricky trying to do that. It's like
Yep.
I'm sure
It
you've
is. It's
experienced
very,
that, when the generation gaps come in as well, right? But this was a whole
absolutely.
double whammy on top of it.
Absolutely. So, what would you say to your younger self who was landing in the United States? I assume for the first time when you came here. Maybe you've been here before. Little nervous, okay, by yourself, I assume. What do you wish you would have known at that point that you know now that you could have told yourself that would have eased some of your anxiety or your nervousness?
That is a very good question.
We only ask good questions on this show.
Yes, I love that. For me, I think I love America's organized sector. I wasn't aware of the nonprofit. In India, we do a lot of service, which I call seva, where I grew up, but it's not organized and formalized, I will say, right? So learning that for me has been, I've always volunteered in different ways. Even in my engineering school, I used to volunteer with the National Social Services. So I had a natural inclination for that. And maybe if I had started marrying those two sides of my personality earlier, and learning more would have been, beneficial. Where this has become my second career, if you may, of, in the social services space, and I'm enjoying that a lot. But my journey in America has been amazing. Let me say this. So for me, I have, gone from strength to strength in so many ways. But as a younger self, just connecting with being able to connect with mainstream culture, where building those relationships, for example, with the African American community or the Hispanic American community. I did not study American history. Did I not know about the racial disparities that had happened? Because I only looked at it from world history perspective, right? And the world history that was taught to us about America was very different. So for me now is when we are learning about it. And now hopefully we can step up and be there for all the communities so that we don't continue those practices that America has, propagated earlier, unfortunately. That is important.
Well, this has been fascinating. You're obviously a very thoughtful lady, and thank you for the service that you've provided our community and for bringing together the technical and the humanitarian components. I think that's, the skills you bring are absolutely essential in the nonprofit sector, and it's too often absent. So I want to thank you for that, and thank you for being available for this interview.
Really appreciate this and hope we can bring our communities together so that we can, really work on the unity and diversity part in America in a way that works for all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And And thank you to Kate Tolliver, our managing producer, for all the help that she's provided. And thank all of you who are watching the program. You can read more about Shubhada Saxena and Aspire to Age and the topics we just discussed, and have access to the website for the Commission on Asian American Quality of Life Commission, and view previous and future episodes of Civil Society at nonprofitaustin.org/civil-society. Again, thank you all, and thank you, Shubhada, and you all take care. Have a great day.